Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Before now, I've never seen Tuskar Rock. When I was younger, I think it became almost mythical. Its Norse name probably gave it a kind of otherworldly feel. And that's kind of how the story of Tuskar Rock always was for me. Always stories, the big reports in their ring binder with a black and white picture of a plane on the cover, sitting there on the shelf in my parents' house. The very occasional clip on TV or the radio. It's always second hand, it's always at a remove. But the rock is there, off the coast of Wexford. So I'm heading there now from Dublin, going with my mum and three of my aunts, Eileen, Siobhan and Colette, and we're going to head to a beach where we can see Tuskar Rock, and to a memorial dedicated to the victims of the crash. This is the final leg of my journey, and as we head towards the Wexford coastline, I'll explain to you how, after more than 30 years, a new examination of what caused the crash of the Aer Lingus St Phelim would utterly rewrite the story the world knew about the tragedy at Tuskar Rock.
We were told originally in the first investigation that it took off from Cork, flew to 17,000 feet, something happened and it fell into the sea. And that was the end.
The possibility of a cause other than a collision or near collision with another airborne object, being the initial case of the upset to the St Phelim, does not appear to have been adequately examined in the 1970 report.
The Minister has now appointed 2 international air crash investigators to carry out a new study.
On January 24th, 2002, relatives of victims attended a presentation of the study findings. Piece by piece, the international team would lay out their case for why the fate of the St Phelim had been far different to the story found in the pages of the 1970 report.
The Irish Times, January 25th, 2002. Unlike the original investigation, investigators used data from all other incidents and accidents involving Viscount planes worldwide. The circumstances of a crash in Indonesia in 1972 were deemed particularly relevant in the latest attempts to understand what happened.
Of the 445 Vickers Viscounts ever made, 172 were eventually lost to an accident or an incident. About 1/3 of those involved fatalities. Over 1,500 people around the world have died in Viscount crashes. Back in 1970, the investigators compared some of the Viscount crashes that had come before, but they found nothing of major significance that they thought would offer clues about the end of the Aer Lingus plane. Of all the crashes of Viscounts around the world though, there was one in particular they could have looked at, but didn't. Aer Lingus EI-AOF was a Vickers Viscount.
Another one was lost in June 67 where 2 trainee pilots and a trainer pilot were killed. And its last 20 minutes were exactly the same as the last 20 minutes of this aircraft, according to witnesses.
2 Aer Lingus Viscounts crashed within 9 months of each other, and in 1970, the state investigators didn't compare the two. In 2002, the international team found that the crashes were similar enough in their final 20 minutes that they recommended reopening the files on the EI-AOF. And then there was the maintenance. Key maintenance records for the EI-AOM were missing. This was known in 1970, but never included in the report.
The guy who signed off on the last maintenance check on this plane was also the guy who did the first investigation. Jeez, that's funny, isn't it?
In the international team's study, they're clear. There's never any evidence found to directly prove poor maintenance led to the crash. And the report points out that this was before the days of computerisation of records, and it was a time when standards of maintenance record keeping across the globe in aviation weren't great. But this was their verdict.
With respect to maintenance in general carried out by Aer Lingus, the many serious errors discovered in the maintenance plan of the aircraft do not inspire confidence in the maintenance culture of the airline at that time.
And when we talk about missing maintenance files at Aer Lingus, for my family, there's an obvious deeper layer to all of this. You'll remember that 2 of my granddad's brothers worked for Aer Lingus at the time of the crash. One is Dermot, who's known as Georgie. He was senior in the maintenance department.
I think I felt incredibly bad for my uncle. I just kind of felt, how did you, poor man, how did you live your life? And I believe he never fully recovered. As in, it's always been such a big thing in his life. But I think he was doing his job to the best of the standards of the day. You know, that's the way I'd see it.
I tried to talk to him about this, and he just said to me, look, Peter, he says, it won't bring Desi back, I've no interest. Doherty's a lovely man. I really like him. Met him recently, hadn't seen him for years. But like any human being, was in a very different cup between a rock and a hard place. And what do? You bury it, you know.
Doherty decided he didn't want to do an interview for this programme. He said he'd rather not revisit it. I think that's fair. The other brother is Arthur. Arthur was the Deputy General Manager of the airline, and he was the acting head of Aer Lingus on the day of the crash.
The teleprinter started to print out the list of passengers, which of course would have come from the check-in in Cork, and the second or third name on it was Desmond Walls. Well, my own name is sufficiently uncommon. It was reasonably obvious that it was my brother, and the first thing then I had to do was call his wife, and she said, "Oh, do you want to speak to Desi? He's gone to London." And I said, "Well, he's not really going to work out that way. He's not going to get there because the airplane is missing." And she said, "Is there any hope?" And I said, "The presumption at this stage has to be no."
Arthur also presided over the Aer Lingus investigation into the crash. Publicly, we know he maintained he knew of no cause, but we also know that privately he admitted he had some suspicions. While I was doing background research for this programme, I spoke to a few experts on aviation: pilots, air crash investigators, people who know their planes and people who know how to investigate when they crash. One of those people is Eoin Brennan. Kevin's a retired Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Corps. These days, he teaches aviation safety at a university. And in between chatting about the reports, Kevin told me about a meeting he had had with Arthur.
He said it was his belief that a mechanical catastrophe of some kind had happened to the elevator control system, and that while the aircraft had been flown for a while after the failure had taken place, it was no longer possible to fly the aircraft, and it had spun into the sea and killed all on board. And that was he told his mother that, he accepted it. It was not any fault of the flight crew or of the maintainers of the aircraft. It's just one of those things that happened, and the fact that they couldn't find all of the tail convinced him that was the case.
Arthur passed away in 2000, so we never heard what he thought of the new reviews of the crash, and we can't get his side of the story now. But what Arthur suspected back in the mid-80s would prove to be very accurate. We have no idea what hard evidence Arthur did or did not find to go with his educated guess. We have no idea how hard he tried or didn't try within Aer Lingus to contest the vague findings of the 1970 report, or if he tried at all. I think it might be understating it to say this is a pretty complicated situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and sum up the range of views on all of this in the family with two people. First is my uncle Desi, and the other is my mum, Christine, because I think that they offer a pretty fair cross-section of the feeling among the 11 siblings.
I think Arthur was basically honest man. That was my opinion would have been that. But he was an honest, conservative man. And conservative people don't even realise they're being dishonest when they're protecting their conservativeness. That's what I believe. When they're protecting the world as it stands, they don't realise that they're deliberately being biased. Even if the status quo is wrong, don't touch it, leave it alone. So I think he could have been guilty in that way, of naturally believing, well, this is the way. And he did say on a couple of occasions, I have a duty to the company I was working for.
Not a duty to his brother?
That's all I heard, now that he said he had a duty to the company he was working for. But I mean, naturally, I suppose the drama lies there.
I do think I wouldn't be surprised if he knew more than he ever told us, but talked himself into that there was no point in telling anybody. And I would imagine too that I always think it's very, very hard to judge something from years gone by because the world worked differently. I'm not saying that you excuse things from the past because of that, but you have to put on your old-fashioned cap when you're looking at something from years gone by. So, as he would have convinced himself that there was no point, it wasn't going to bring Desi back. I mean, my mum even took that attitude. Whether he did or he didn't, I would imagine he just convinced himself that it didn't matter one way or the other.
St Ibar's Cemetery is in Crosstown in County Wexford. If you take a left when you come through the gate, you'll find a corner that's unlike anything else in there.
It's just in this hedged area.
There's a grey monument. It's got a polished black face and it's probably 6 feet tall. It's circled by 4 small stone benches and low hedges. It's maybe a little unkempt on the day we visit, but it's nice. It is peaceful.
So it doesn't say when. Erected by Aer Lingus in memory of those who died in the air accident off the Wexford coast near Tuskar Rock on the 24th of March 1968. And that's the names.
These are the names here. There he is.
All those other names, it makes you realise how much bigger a story it was, how many other people were affected. You know, multiply our story or add on 60 other stories, some of which, of course, there was more than one family member.
More than one member who died. Yeah, I think that's just so sad, particularly if they lost both their parents, which you can see.
Yeah, there's a few of them.
Yeah. Roland Wakerling and Mrs. Madeline. Like they probably left children behind them.
Oh yeah, no.
God, yeah. We were kind of lucky, weren't we?
Not right, but I'm thinking of all of these people standing together. You know, like that's what I'm visualising.
For getting on the plane.
Yeah. But they did walk out across the tarmac.
Yeah, they would have. Yeah.
We saw them from
They wouldn't have been going in a queue like Ryanair. I think they kind of went. My memory is they kind of went out at their leisure to the plane. Do you?
They did. Well, Mommy told me that Daddy came back through the gate to say goodbye to me.
Yeah, but that was before he was walking out the tarmac.
No, he'd gone out. Well, no, maybe he wasn't on the tarmac yet, but he came back before he went out.
That you just look at all those names and you go, oh my God, the number of people who suffered because of that one plane crash.
I can't tell you the story of these people, the 60 beside Desmond Walls who died on that day. I imagine their family's experience of Tuskar Rock are all unique, and they won't see this the way my family does. But from what I have read and heard, it seems that for a lot of people, the 2002 report was a strange mixture of anger and new pain, as well as a lot of relief and some sort of closure. Whatever about the history of the Viscount or missing maintenance files, the central piece of evidence in the international team's argument were the witnesses. 46 witnesses. And a lot of those 46 had either not been heard from or had been dismissed in 1970.
The Irish Times, January 25th, 2002, stating that accounts of the plane's movements offered by about 46 witnesses were dismissed by the original investigation. The new report found the evidence of witnesses could be considered to be factual, since all statements fit one to another.
Siobhan was at the presentation of the report in January 2002, and over a cup of tea, she spoke with one of the investigators afterwards.
And so they spoke to a lot of those witnesses again, any that were still living and they could find, and they reviewed all of those statements, and they found a pattern then and realised that any witness whose account contradicted the air traffic control report from Shannon, those witnesses were discounted. So that was a big news as well.
Witnesses told investigators for the 1970 report that they saw an Aer Lingus plane flying low in the sky, seemingly in trouble, but Shannon Air Traffic Control's transcripts showed the plane reporting to them from 17,000 feet. So how can both be true? In 1970, investigators decided, obviously, they couldn't. But if anyone was right, it must be air traffic control.
They said, yes, we believe they saw something. But it couldn't have been the Viscount, because we know from our evidence that the Viscount was at 17,000 feet. There were 46 witnesses, 8 of whom said they saw Aer Lingus written on the side of the aircraft. They're coming out of Mass in Ballykelly Church in Wexford, and they said they could see the people through the window.
The international investigators in 2002 were unambiguous. The plane never reached 17,000 feet, and for most of its flight, it must have been flying too low to make radio contact with Shannon.
Under the assumption that the crew did not do anything irregular, the conclusion that the transcript of the Shannon radio comms does not describe the exact radio telephony is inescapable.
They say Shannon Air Traffic Control made a mistake, or worse, that there could have been false messages inserted into the record, but they find no conclusive proof of this. They effectively replaced the suspicion of a conspiracy of a British military cover-up with the suspicion of major failures at air traffic control at Shannon, or maybe even a cover-up. The controller of Shannon Air Traffic Control on the day of the crash completely rejected the findings of the 2002 report in connection with air traffic control. And the ignoring of the witnesses, for my family, that's where the anger comes from.
There's a big difference between doing something, making a mistake, and trying to hide a mistake. But I remember that day, it was coming in the car park where we told Mammy. I was livid with them. I was, how dare you think that me and my siblings, and my mother particularly, are not important enough to know the truth. And that day, I was really angry.
I think if somebody dies, you eventually get over that side of it, why it happened or how it happened or whatever. But to make sure we didn't find out why it happened, that's a different human issue, if you like. That's a betrayal, if you know what I mean. I don't know who they were trying to protect, but they certainly weren't trying to protect us.
The effect of it not being handled properly by my tribes people, by the people I honoured in society, left me devastated. You know, and it caused all my midlife crisis and, yeah, huge, really deep effect, but not him dying in a plane crash. That happens. We're human beings, we get born, we die, life and death are the same thing. We can live with that. What we cannot live with is deceit.
We're going now to Nethertown Beach, and from there we'll be able to see Tuskar Rock.
Is that it? Yes, that is Tuskar Rock, yeah. That's it, yeah. Well, it's a bit of a way away, but that's it.
You can see the lighthouse there.
When the team of international experts considered all of their findings, they came to conclusions that were vastly different from the government report of 1970.
In a report which casts further doubt over the findings of the original investigation, an independent team of air crash experts dismissed theories that the Aer Lingus plane was hit by an unmanned drone or missile.
And then we come to the questions that are still there, because there was no definitive answer, just a mixture of probable and possible.
The results of the third investigation into the crash of the St. Phelim in March 1968 were outlined this afternoon. The three international investigators said the crash was probably due to metal fatigue, affecting the horizontal tail of the aircraft.
Investigators found that there was an initial upset. Something happened to damage the tail, and from that point on, the plane gradually deteriorated until it crashed. The possible causes for that something were a bird strike on the plane, maintenance problems, corrosion, and a door strike. That means a door could have come off the plane and hit the tail. Now, the two scenarios that were considered probable were metal fatigue and flutter. Flutter is a fault in the tail that causes a piece to vibrate. So, it was probably a fault in the plane. The answers were always there. Beside bird strike, the investigators are really not entertaining any other possibility than the fault lay within the plane.
Being here, for me, is the most... Everything else has been in my head about how Daddy died and where he died. And the picture was in my head, and this just makes it more real. That we are actually almost at the spot where he took his last breath. Yeah. Although we've never seen that. That's just.
But do you imagine, when you're here, like I was asking, we must go back and check that report, which direction the plane was coming from? Was it coming straight out from here, further north? No. Where was it coming from? Because the first thing I did when I spotted it was imagine an Aer Lingus plane going nose first into the water.
So you're visualising?
Yes, but I do that regularly. I still regularly dream about planes crashing. Usually the water outside the front in Dublin Bay, like it's usually there, but anywhere. I dream about plane crashes all of the time still, and it's always an Aer Lingus plane. Yeah. Sometimes I'm on it, sometimes I'm not, but I always see it going nose first into the water. That always features in every dream.
I never imagine it going nose first.
Did it go nose first, or was he trying to land still on the water?
Oh yeah.
I suppose I imagined he was still trying to land on the water.
Yeah, that's probably why I think it was a belly flop.
So you all in your head, you have
An image, yeah.
If
You'd have an
you look
image.
out there and you visualise what happened, you'd all see slightly different things.
Yeah.
It's funny, I don't think of how it went in at all. I just think of it way down at the bottom of the sea and the wreckage.
And that they dropped it.
But
They
it's
dropped
hardly
the
there
middle of the
anymore.
plane
No.
down again when they tried to rescue
There
it.
must be bits of it still there, Siobhan.
The new report didn't just try to get to the root of what caused the crash. It also went into some significant detail on exactly what happened that morning. It's a pretty incredible story, and it's not accepted by everybody. There are some people who refute the scenario that the international team lay out. Critics of it say it's just not believable that a Viscount could recover from 2 spins. They ask why the pilots didn't send a mayday call. Critics say you can't rely on witnesses to the degree that they do in the new report. The authors of the study anticipate a lot of these arguments, and they offer their reasons for rejecting them. For some people, they're not happy with those explanations. They think there's more to know. The missile theory, for one, is still out there. There's a lot of theories out there about exactly what happened that morning. And when it comes to Tuskar Rock and theories about what happened, we could be here all day. But for a lot of people, including my family, the 2002 report is the closest thing to truth. And for those who do believe it, the story of the 46 witnesses didn't just cause them anger, it also caused a lot more hurt. Because the new story is far worse than what was told in 1970. This is what the team of international experts say happened to Aer Lingus Flight 712 on March 24th, 1968. The St. Phelim takes off from Cork Airport at 11:32 on Sunday morning. 10 minutes later, a man in yawl watches the plane climbing steadily in the distance, reaching somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 feet.
He was standing out, watching the aircraft go out. And he said, next thing he just fell out of the sky. And he said, I blessed myself and prayed for the people on that aircraft, he said, because it just disappeared down behind a hill.
The witness sees the descent as almost vertical. Investigators believe that Captain O'Byrne, who had been an Air Corps pilot, manages to pull the plane out of the spin. The plane is then seen trying to turn, possibly back to Cork. One witness sees it twice fly in a circle. The plane is as low as 1,000 feet off the ground. But the St. Phelim can't make it back to Cork. Investigators believe it's been too badly damaged. It flies on, along the coast, before heading northeast. The plane climbs steadily, before turning left suddenly and heading north. A young boy in a field sees the Viscount approach. It flies so low, it looks like it's going to land. The boy dives on the ground. The grass around him ruffles as the plane suddenly climbs and turns sharply at the last moment.
And it flew right at him, and then flew away. And he said it was an Aer Lingus Viscount. And he said it was so close that it ruffled the grass.
The boy watches it fly east, slowly climbing for 3 or 4 minutes, before he sees the plane fall. This is the second fall. The plane has now been in trouble for 15 minutes. This moment is when the investigators suspect the final radio transmissions are sent. They're picked up by London Air Traffic Control. At 11:58, Echo, India, Alpha, Oscar Mike, with you. A radio transmission completely out of the ordinary. That's followed seconds later by the last words heard from the St. Phelim, which investigators say they believe is 5,000 feet, descending, spinning rapidly. The pilots pull out of the second drop, and the Viscount continues, east. In Ballykelly Church, as Mass ends, the congregation hears a heavy sound from outside, growing louder. Stepping out of the church, they see an Aer Lingus plane approaching, low in the sky. The plane roars overhead. Witnesses say it avoids the church steeple only with a last-moment turn. Witnesses would later also claim the plane is so low that they can see into the back 10 rows, where passengers crouch forward. From this point on, the plane seems to begin showing signs of the faults that will seal its fate. Fuel coming from an engine, and noises that tell them the plane is struggling. Piecing it together, investigators say they believe this shows the emergency manoeuvres have inflicted damage on the plane that is growing worse. The plane flies south, towards Hook Head, before it turns back on itself, towards Feathered. Finally, it turns east, towards Tuskar Rock. By now, the St. Phelim has been looping and turning across Wexford and Waterford for almost half an hour. total, the plane would fly for 32 minutes after its first spin.
Through all of those 30 years, we'd gone around with the story of the plane was in trouble for 10 minutes. Turns out it was closer to 30 minutes. That was very hard to imagine.
Yeah, I would imagine he was terrified, just terrified. You know, and he probably had time to think about what he was leaving behind him, and, you know, mum with 12 kids. And
I always imagine my dad would have been a hero on the plane, looking after other people, and I know he would have. And I thought about that.
I think he'd have gone coldly accepting. This is it, there's nothing I can do. Whatever it's going to be, and that's fine. He had a great faith that there was a purpose to the whole thing. An existence broader than our narrow view of it.
I know Mammy had always said, as long as it was quick for him, as long as it was quick. I don't know whether we were right or wrong, but we told her that it was 30 minutes. I'll never forget the look on her face then. Somebody once said that if Daddy had been on the Titanic, he would have been the one singing "Nearer, My God" to Thee. I'd say he was the brave one.
In their battle to keep control of the plane, the two pilots have been wrestling with forces of up to 450 pounds just to maintain control. That's the equivalent of lifting almost 3 grown men. First Officer Paul Heffernan is just 22 years old.
It took a superhuman effort to keep the plane flying that long, and the reason they kept it flying that long was they were trying to find somewhere to land.
Aer Lingus EI AOM flies out over the sea. But as they fly out above the blue water on that crystal clear day, with the Wexford shoreline to the left and the white of Tuskar Rock lighthouse flashing beneath them, the Aer Lingus St. Phelim goes out of control entirely and finally. At roughly 12:15, a Spanish sailor sees a flash of a plane crashing into the sea. A column of water rises to the sky before calm settles again. This is the reality my family and the families of all the victims have known in detail since 2002. Since the 30th anniversary, and particularly since the 2002 study was published, it feels to me like my family has moved on again. There's been a greater peace with Tuskar Rock. And like 30 years was a new marking, so too is 50. And as it was on March the 24th, 1968, when each of the 12 lived that day differently, they all live with Tuskar Rock in their own way now. My granny died in 2006 at the age of 82. Despite everything she was put through, she made a fantastic life for herself. She lived out her final years between Slayhead and South Africa. She currently has around 75 direct descendants, and she left behind a family that seems to grow closer as it expands. And I haven't mentioned him yet, but this story is incomplete without Paddy. I still catch myself taking a brief pause every time I say the 11 siblings in the family, because it was always the full dozen until a few years ago. Paddy was 7 when his dad died. He became an alcoholic and he died from his drinking before he reached 50.
I do think it affected the boys because they didn't have a role model. I think they were very affected by Paddy in particular. And I spent many a night discussing it with Paddy and all the conspiracy theories, and he didn't ever settle with it.
How do you mean?
Well, I do think it's one of the reasons he never got a handle on life. That he never got past it. He didn't see the point. He was such a clever, amazing person, and he couldn't see the point in that. I think probably because Daddy had been a clever, amazing person who just disappeared one day, you know. I mean, that sounds very basic, but you know what I mean. You'd need a psychiatrist, but again, one of those, you can't answer those questions, you know. There is no conclusion to those. They're all only theories.
This is a story that doesn't have an ending. It carries on forever. Its shape changes as the years pass. This is just what it looks like today, or what part of it looks like. For me, Tuskar Rock feels much more present. I see how it still lives in the background of my family now. I understand them all as individuals and as a group a lot better. It's like someone's sharpened up an old grainy photo and I can see everything in the background much clearer. And when I stand there on that beach alone with my mum on that grey day, staring out at the rock like a blot on the horizon, it's then that I think I see it more clearly than I have ever before.
It's always in your mind with the rock when you look at that. It's kind of making me feel a little uncomfortable because although it's probably all disintegrated, I know that that's somewhere out there close to there. That's where he went down.
So that's where he still is?
That's where he still is. But that just feeling of the reality of it, do you know what I mean? I know it's real, but the reality that it really was a plane that went down over there and he was on it, that's just kind of, it's probably just making you look at it in the eye. That's what you do when you come down here. You just kind of, you feel it in your stomach. I think that's what I'm doing here, I think.
Does it make you miss him?
No, I don't think I miss him. I miss not knowing him. I miss you guys, my children, not knowing him. I would have loved my children to know him. Because he was such an interesting character. I think that it would have been lovely. I often think of how different my life would be. It would have been very different if my father had lived. Very different. I remember him all right. I do remember him. I remember even his voice. I would fairly well remember what he looks like. Like as in his stature, and I remember his little habits. He used to blink an awful lot. He'd do that all the time. I remember his hands, and I'd have great memories of him building boats and bringing us out on the boat. And
so in his hands,
I just remember how they look. But I just know what his hands look like in my head. Well, I think I do. So I think it's the feeling of when you have to look something in the eye, and I think that's what it is. And you look out at that rock and you just see, what I see is, oh, it actually did happen out there. That's where it went down. That's where my dad died. Yeah, I think that's what that rock does to me. Just makes me look it in the eye.
You okay?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'm fine, thanks.
Thanks, Mum.